Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do. In this episode, I interview Sean West, co-founder of Hence AI and author of Unruly, who explores how the collision of politics, technology, and law creates new risks and how we can fight back. Welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm Tom Martin, your host, and today I'm really thrilled to have Sean West as a guest. He is the co-founder of Hence.ai, Hence Technologies, but he's also the author of a book that's coming out that I'm really excited for us to talk about. Sean has an interesting background. He is an expert at assessing geopolitical and global risk, and Hence dovetails with that. And also this book is just putting it front and center. And it is just, I was very fortunate to get an advance view of it from Sean, but it's called Unruly, Fighting Back When Politics, AI, and the Law Upend the Rules of Business. So, very much in the air right now. Very excited to have him on the show. And Sean, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're up to now.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Tom, it's such a pleasure to be on here. I love your Substack, and I love all of these podcasts. So it's amazing to actually be here and talk about the world. So, this week is an exciting week because we're actually releasing the book. It's been a lot of work, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But it literally, like an hour before it showed up at my door, I finally have a physical copy. So, you're the first human beside my wife to see this physical copy. So it does exist. It is not a myth. We're an interesting organization. Most software companies don't have their founders take a substantial amount of time to write a book as part and parcel of the business, right? That would be like a side hustle or a hobby or something like that. For us, understanding the space that we're in, understanding the world we're in, makes us build better software and makes us be more relevant for other folks. So I'm happy to tell you how we got here. But I wake up every day looking out at the world and saying, there isn't just one static problem that existed that we wanted to solve 5 years ago when we set up our company. The world is dynamic, and you got to have your finger on the pulse of where it's going to build anything that's relevant today.
And you certainly have your finger on the pulse of what's going on right now. One thing that I was blown away by is that you have like a quote from Mustafa Suleyman on the front of your book. That's an amazing feat there. And he had really nice things to say about the book, as did Bridget McCormack. So I mean, the early reviews are just rave reviews, and I guess I just want to say thank you too for casting some light on this, because it's certainly something that we're all a bit confused and a little worried about right now. So I think the more light we could shed on that, the better.
Yeah, it's been interesting, right? I'll tell kind of the origin story of the book a little bit. I was going to all of these legal conferences, right? We're fundamentally, Hence has been a legal technology company for the 5 years we've been around. So I was going to all these legal conferences and was stunned that it was, often just lawyers talking to lawyers about being lawyers. Well, the whole world was falling apart around them. And also with Gen AI and everything, everyone's focused entirely on the productivity gains that they can get, but often forget that it exists at the pleasure of the political and regulatory process. And so I stepped back and I sort of said, well, most general counsels that I'm talking to are actually they're pretty concerned about the global dynamic around them, but they often were not trained to assess global risk, right? Many GCs are legal first, and then they rise up to become GC or chief legal officer. And then they have this broad advantage. The board is calling them and saying, there's a war that's disrupting our supply chain. What can we do with all of our contracts for customers or something like this? They're having to upskill on it. Some are political GCs, but they're often there from a lobbying point of view. And so I stepped back and I said, well, there's a really interesting space here because politics is shifting. We're exiting the globalization era that had kind of convergence of rules and norms. At the same time that the role of law and the rule of law in society is coming under stress, we feel, you can highlight an erosion of rule of law in a lot of places. And then you've got all of that about to get changed by technology, which is shifting politics and is shifting law at the same time. And so I started writing this book with an eye towards how can I help general counsels navigate geopolitics. But as I started writing, I realized that actually the law itself wasn't a dependent variable. The law was actually one of the variables that's shifting and affecting the state of the world. And so what I ended up doing was putting law, politics, and technology on equal planes and saying it's even worse than the fact that all three of these are changing at once. It's that they're colliding with each other and creating new synthetic risks we've never been prepared for. And that's a very different mindset than most business leaders, regardless of the function they sit in, have. And I felt like that was interesting to say. And I think that's a big reason why when you go through the early reviews and the endorsements of the book, you've got tech leaders, you've got top lawyers, you've got CEOs, you've got the former head of the CIA, you've got a couple of prime ministers. Like it resonated with a whole lot of people because most of them are used to looking at the world in their lane. And if you can make them think outside their lane, then you've done something new for them. And so, my hope with the book is that it just forces people for the hours that they spend reading it to realize that being excellent at what you do is gonna be necessary but not sufficient for the future. You're gonna have to be good at a lot of other things, or at least have people tracking them and working on them for you going forward.
Wow. Well, that's a great preview of what we're going to talk about in the book. There's so much going on there. Mustafa, like I'm a big fan of his, and having read the Coming Wave, it's interesting that it's quite similar, like conceptually, the way what he approached and what you're approaching, in the sense that multiple things coming together, not just one wave, but multiple, and then there's a resonance between them that multiplies the potential impact they can have.
Yeah, I mean, The Coming Wave was a phenomenal book and inspired a lot of my thought process around this. I mean, I met Mustafa many years ago, and like when that book came out, I was like, great, I can catch up with everything he thinks about what's going on in the world. And that book opened my eyes to all sorts of risks, like biotechnology risks and all sorts of things that I hadn't previously thought of, and really sort of made me think, well, what if we turn the lens of all of this volatility on questions about how this affects the law and how this affects the assumptions we have when we do business in different jurisdictions. We're experiencing that in the US right now. Doing business in the US today is a little different than it was 3 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago. You know what I mean? It's like it changes by the day. And so I think that technology piece often is kind of like this fascination for non-technical business leaders where they're like, oh, there's lots going on there, and it'll be a productivity solution for us. It'll be an accelerant for us. We'll invest in it, it'll be innovative. But the problem is that there's a political reaction function to technology. You go invent driverless cars and put them on the street, and the political system will tell you whether they think that's good or safe or something to support or something to stop, right? Go release your AI agent and call it a robot lawyer, and the political system will tell you if that's a good idea or a bad idea, right? And so I think that kind of like tech being something that creates synthetic risk or synthetic opportunity for companies is something that we really had to grapple with. And what I tried to do in the book is say, what are these actual synthetic risks? Can we give some terms to it? And so, we can dive into that, but I try to give some language, not just, I think there are a lot of books that can say the world is going crazy. Here's 20 things that are wrong, and they all present risk. And like a lot of people stop their book there. Or maybe they're more ambitious and they say, here's 20 things that are going wrong, and here's how you can like survive. Cool. Like that's all good. What I wanted to do is say, well, there's all these things that are going nuts. Let's try and think about the synthetic risks they create by their interactions. And then let's equip you to fight back. You're not helpless. You're a business leader. You have a lot more ways to navigate this than the average citizen. So let's tell you what those are and help you equip yourself.
All right. Well, we're definitely getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
I do want to see, where this came from, because I know you have, a degree in international politics from Georgetown. You have a master's in public policy from Berkeley, and the origin story I want to get to. Like, I think, fundamentally that we're all influenced by our origins and where we grew up and our family and all that. And even though this might feel like a backtrack, I think that it'll help us to see how things make sense going forward. So let me ask you that, like, where did you grow up? What kind of neighborhood was it?
Yeah, well, so by birth, I am a New York City kid. Was born in Manhattan. I lived in Manhattan until I was 8, and my parents decided that they were sick of winter, and also like New York City during the years I was growing up was not particularly safe, and so they said, well, let's get out of here. So we loaded up in the Volvo and drove across country and landed in California. And we landed in Laguna Beach, actually, of all places, which today wouldn't sound random in a world of virtual work, but like when we did this when I was a child, like a phone call back to the East Coast was $3 a minute. A flight would have cost us like $2,000 in today's money, right? So the decision to pick up and go was like a very, a very sort of different decision than most families were making at the time. And so I kind of from birth straddled these two worlds of like hyper type A New Yorker, like deep down inside. But I got to California and nobody knows how to react to that in California. They actually don't like it. And so I had to cool off and not be that. Right. And so I had to kind of
Yeah.
figure out a different mentality. And we ended up landing in San Diego after the fires in Laguna Beach in I think it was 1993. We ended up moving to San Diego. And in San Diego, I got really interested in doing mock political programs. And, I got into public speaking. That was something that I had some friends who were like taking a public speaking course in the school. And they said, you should try this. And actually, a lot of public speaking is oriented towards advocacy. So I started doing public speaking competitions, advocating around politics. And then I got involved. Actually, the YMCA Youth and Government program was probably the biggest impact on me, which is this sort of, it runs in a lot of different states. In California, there was a statewide program. About 2,000 kids would be involved in a year-long program, and you could run for office. And so I ran and was elected to different national offices in that program, which then got me into Boys State, which is this kind of American Legion run program. There's actually an amazing documentary on the run for governor in Texas of Texas Boys State. I actually won governor of California's Boys State, and so watching that was kind of fun. But I got really into this stuff, and I was sort of, all set to just be like a domestic policy guy. That was like I knew state politics, I knew national politics, I loved it. And a good friend of mine had told me he was applying to Georgetown's international affairs program, and I had never really thought about international affairs. It was like my dad had taken me to Europe a couple of times at a young age, wanted me to think globally about the world, but I had kind of like I hadn't been thinking that way because I was having success and fun doing a lot of the domestic stuff. And I ended up landing at Georgetown in this small international affairs school of 300 kids a year. Really trains you to be, the goal is to be a diplomat, right? That's the School of Foreign Service, trains you to be a diplomat. So I was learning about the whole world. I didn't know anything about it. That opened up some really interesting opportunities, but it really just opened up my mind. And I write a lot. I read about a lot about this in the book. Actually landed at Georgetown, and you had to be fluent in a language to graduate. And I already knew Spanish, so that wasn't going to be any fun. So my dad said, "Well, China's opening up. Why don't you do Chinese?" I thought, okay. So I took this like intensive Chinese course, and I was terrible at it. Just absolutely terrible. I'm like monotone, right? It's not tonal language was not my thing. And so I survived for like a semester. I said, you know what, I'll just do fluency in Spanish. But my dad said to me, why don't we go to China? And let's go, you learned some of it. Let's go check it out. And we did this trip in 2001 to Beijing. And that to me really opened my eyes, where I was kind of like, okay, the world is huge. I can feel comfortable anywhere in the world. This is, what I want to do is build a career that spans all these different things. And so that was kind of the origin story for me in looking out. And so, Georgetown, I focused on international law and international politics as an undergraduate, but, that gave me this kind of really broad canvas on which to build the rest of my career.
So I do want to pause on that for a second and unpack it a little bit because there's a lot, especially the influence from your father and taking you abroad to, I had a similar experience actually when I was about 12 that my dad took me to Europe, including Eastern Europe,
Oh,
which
wow.
I'm a bit older than you. At the time that I went over there, there was still the Iron Curtain, and we went to Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and it was interesting to see the stark difference between the United States Eastern Europe. Um, but I connect with the fact that those early impressions open our world. I'm also curious though about what was your dad doing at the time? What was your mom doing, and what influence did that have on you?
Sure. Well, my mom's a speech therapist. So she was able to kind of work anywhere there was a school. So that enabled some flexibility. Also, probably put me on the path to feel comfortable as a public speaker. But she worked with children and future generations for her whole career. And I think for me, that always kind of anchored me in the idea that having impact and contributing to the growth of those that will come after us is, first and foremost, like a very important consideration. And when you're building a business, you can lose track of that, but that always anchored me to come back to that. And my dad did a number of different jobs in the investment world, but almost always for himself. So he had a lot of flexibility in where he wanted to be to do it. And that I think that kind of sense of entrepreneurial spirit and desire to pick your own geography, right? Like when you work for General Electric, like you can't pick up and just go to California because you feel like it, right? But when you build your own enterprise or you work for yourself, you can. And so I think that kind of always seeded this entrepreneurial spirit in the back of my mind that the first half of my career I was an intrapreneur. I had some amazing experiences at a consulting firm, which we can talk about, where I built out a lot of what they were doing with respect to developed country political risk. But I always sort of had this voice in my head that was like, I want to choose my own adventure, and it's very hard to do that when you're locked into what an organization that someone else is the leader of needs from you at that moment, right? That's a very different path.
Absolutely. And when we see examples of people, especially our parents, doing things that it just opens up that possibility for us, working for yourself. Like for some people, if they don't have that example, it might seem unattainable, or it might seem so scary that, you know, maybe they were raised risk averse because their parents were employees and they worked for a very long career for someone else. And so it would seem really risky and scary to go out on your own. But when you have those examples, it really helps to make that possible. And I could see from what you're doing now that, that thread has lived on. So you went to Georgetown. Also, I forgot to mention London School of Economics, which must have been, again, like a broadening experience to study there. And then after that, you were a researcher at the Federal Reserve, and then you worked for Deloitte. So if you could share a little bit about those, that
Yeah,
experience.
sure. Well, so look, I got to Georgetown, and it was, 9/11 happened like 2 weeks after I got there. And that was pretty formative for me. Like I was sitting in my dorm room, I had a view of the Potomac, which I thought was going to be awesome. And I'm sitting there watching like the Pentagon on fire 2 weeks after I got to college. And I'm thinking to myself, like, man, everything I wanted to do in DC, I can't do. Like we had the anthrax scares, there was like the DC sniper came after, the idea that you're going to work on Capitol Hill, like you couldn't even approach the Capitol, right? It's suddenly like everything. DC was not the place I wanted to be after that. Like it made me really uncomfortable. I was there for a couple of years and I said, I really want to go abroad. So I applied to LSE for my third year as an undergraduate. And I got to London and it was like a breath of fresh air for me because it was just a different context, a different place, a different education style, right? The British education style is the most expensive reading list you'll ever buy. Like, here's a reading list. We'll give you some exams in July. Like you can show up to lectures if you want, you don't have to. I chose to bartend. I met my wife. It was like, yeah, I had a blast. And I learned a lot. And my horizons opened up a lot more because it was a lot of European students, not just British students. I was meeting all these people from around the world. And I realized I had enough credits to graduate. So I just applied to graduate school. I didn't go back for my fourth year to undergrad. I got into Berkeley for public policy. And I went and did this domestic policy degree because I felt like I had been so removed from domestic stuff. I really wanted to understand it. So I went back and did that. And I got a job at Deloitte working with the federal government clients. And the sales pitch was, for all of you who understand public policy, there's a lot of work the government needs done. You can have impact, but you can also get trained to be a private sector consultant, get paid like one. And by the way, because your client's likely to be the federal government, you don't have the crazy travel schedule that commercial consultants have. And I said, yes, that sounds good. And I was there for a couple of years and, it was finishing school, right? Like that's what they say about those consulting jobs. Like you might have gone to graduate school, but you lack polish. You completely are not unpolished. So polishes you. It was really useful in that sense. But I really kept feeling this calling back to the international world. And so I applied to Eurasia Group. And I ended up with a job there at a time when Eurasia Group, which at the time was like, and probably still is kind of this edgiest, coolest consulting firm, but at the time only did emerging markets. And I sort of said I sort of said, okay, cool. I could help understand how US politics is affecting emerging markets. And they said, cool, come on board. I had done my thesis well at Berkeley. I was hired by the Federal Reserve to write a thesis for them on subprime lending. And then the subprime crisis hit. Bear Stearns collapsed like 2 weeks after I got to Eurasia Group. And I said, we should cover domestic US stuff. And at the time, they said, no, we don't do that. And then Lehman collapsed a few months later, and they said, okay, fine, now we do. And so they said, go build it. And so we had to figure out an approach to think about domestic political risk. Nobody had ever thought about that. In 2008, if I called up a CEO and said, let's talk about US political risk, they would say, well, I have access to senators. Why do I need to talk to you about US political risk? Right? The forecasting side of it didn't matter because politics existed in like a bound this big. Maybe you'll pay a little more taxes, maybe you won't, right? Like it's not crazy. Maybe you get some carve out, maybe you won't. But suddenly like the entire economy was imploding and whether it was going to be saved by the government or not, like these were pretty big questions. And so if your El Salvador investment does really, really well, but your US thesis is wrong, like you're in deep trouble. And so that was really the trajectory for me to make a name for myself in thinking about risk. And I had a lot of fun doing that for well over a decade.
I was smiling earlier because I was about to say those were the good old days when it was just like, am I going to pay more taxes or like, like it was just this small amount of risk and you didn't have to be watching every day to know or see what's happening, what's on fire, it's just a bit nuts. So from that experience, and by the way, when you took Chinese, you may have not become super fluent, but I'm sure that probably carried some weight in getting those opportunities that you were just describing, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, my Chinese was pretty terrible, but my mindset about it was very different, right? I mean, I tell this great parable in the story that I was so bad at Chinese. At the end of the year, I told my Chinese teacher I was going to go to China, and she says to me, speak Chinese to Chinese people. And if they speak Chinese back, your Chinese is very good. And if they tell you your Chinese is good in English, it's terrible. And so I tell this story of walking into a record shop in China and speaking the Chinese I know, and the person saying to me in English how great my Chinese is, right? And it's like, okay, fine. It is as poor as I think. But 2001, China, like that was the world opening up. And people today will liken the opening up of Saudi Arabia or of other places to China's always the reference point for that. Because so many people in international business had that experience, whether it was from sourcing or whether it was from selling to China or whether it was from understanding the Chinese as competitors, right? That's like a seminal experience that people in international business have had as a reference point, and is actually the lens through which most of us think about countries opening up or backtracking today.
I also like the point to pull out of this that, a lot of times we think about in a kind of a straightforward way that the thing, for example, in that example, learning Chinese, oh, well, I wasn't fluent in Chinese. Okay. And that's kind of viewed within that little box. But some stuff that's a lot more important is also just like the context within that activity and what it's, where it's happening and the mental frame that it creates. To explore it a little bit more, the fact that you were learning Chinese opened you to the culture of China and also the political changes that were happening in opening up the economy to capitalism within the context of uh, of communism, but definitely opening it up to greater growth and activity. And so, like all of those things wouldn't have happened in the same way if you hadn't studied it, regardless of how proficient you had become. And so, I think sometimes we kind of lose that thread in the sense that every adventure that we take leads us somewhere that we may not have expected to arrive at.
No, that's an amazing, it's an amazing point, and I hadn't thought of it that way, right? I think in the process of writing, you start to reflect on like what were these seminal experiences, but often you don't reflect on the fact that like what if I hadn't made that choice, even the one that worked out poorly, right? It had 10 consequences that actually worked out very well for me. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting one to highlight. And certainly like that respect also for the people who are able to conquer things that you can't conquer comes from trying and failing. And learning a language like Chinese is only one example of that. But you then meet people who turn out to be amazing at things that you gave up on, and you end up realizing they had the tenacity or they had different native skills than you did or whatnot. That ends up building a different degree of respect and a different framework to understand their achievements as well.
Another thread that I'm pulling out of about your journey is that, for all intents and purposes, looking at it in a straightforward way, the degrees that you pursued and also like the debate and it seems natural that you would have gone forward in becoming a politician and that you would have pursued that in terms of living out your education and your talent for persuading people. And yet that didn't happen. And the reason, like one of the things that seems to be, I wouldn't call it an organizing principle, but maybe kismet for you is that your timing, like there's a certain thing with timing in your life where there's just all of these things that happened at certain times that were almost like part of the thread of our recent history that you were just coming into at the moment where it was most formative for you and then pushed you in a different direction than what you would normally expect. And even with this book, like the timing of it, writing about these things in this current moment just seems quite fortuitous.
Some of it is dumb luck or bad luck, right? I mean, 9/11 happening when you start college is bad luck, right? That's awful.
Yeah.
It's not what you want, but it makes you who you are. Actually, an early draft of the book, I did this sort of Forrest Gump thing where it's like I'm present for all of these moments. And one of my early readers when I was in draft form was like, "You don't need to be everywhere in history, like just because you were." That's like not that relevant to the story. I was like, okay, cool, that's cool. I can tone that down a little bit, but some of those moments were really formative, and you want to include it. I think the question of was I on the path to be a politician is a good one. I was, like, I wanted to. I think the challenge is that as soon as you step into the international world, you're no longer playing on the unit of politics, of electoral politics that most societies are organized by, right? You wanna be a senator for the state of California, and have an influence on international policy or whatever it is. You want to be on Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Well, you probably have to be on the Board of Education in some county in California before you can do that. And then you have to be an assembly person. Then you have to be a senator. And if you're running around splitting your life between London and New York and all these different places, you're not going to be a credible candidate in any of these contexts, because all politics is local at the end of the day, and you become this kind of like global elite type, metropolitan personality that appeals to some and has lots of advantages. But unless you set up roots and decide, I'm going to commit to this community for 10 or 15 years, you couldn't actually even be authentic, right? You couldn't be authentic. So I think for me, part of what happened was I got addicted to playing on the global scale. And, then there are opportunities, at the UN or at other organizations. My wife worked at the UN for a long time. Like there's opportunities to be political, but it's not the way we think about elected politics. And so part of what happened for me was I said, I want to do this international stuff. But I also don't want to be a lobbyist. I don't want to play power games. I want to speak truth to power. And, Eurasia Group, founded by Ian Bremmer, was founded on this principle of speaking truth to power. And so, we would fly around the world briefing CEOs and telling them uncomfortable truths about where things were going to go. Like, you may be lobbying to change this policy. You will fail. So prepare for a scenario in the future where you have not succeeded at that thing and you're now dealing with the consequences. And so, kind of bring it back to your point about being present at all these seminal moments in history. A lot of that is the ability then to forecast and choose your own luck. So the book is a great example of that, right? I signed the deal for the book in May, and they said, when will when do you think you can deliver this? I said, I need to write the entire thing before the election. Can update it for, a few days after the election, but I want it to come out in the first 100 days after the election. I think Trump's going to win. And I was documented in saying that. Not, most people did think that by the end. But to me, like as a US politics forecaster, I felt like that was going to happen. I feel like everyone's going to grapple with all these questions. So I can write a lot of this because it's structural stuff about the world and then try and update it. So actually, there's an interesting story. I got the book back from the editors and I had until November 15th to update it for the election, which gave me 10 days to throw away an initial chapter I had pre-written about disputed elections and legal considerations of disputed elections and rewrite something that would then be relevant 6 months later when people actually read it. And if I hadn't been a forecaster, that would be terrifying. I would have punted on it. I would have left that chapter unsaid. But there's a passage in the book where it's like, writing this chapter about the direction of the US at the beginning of a new administration is completely risky, but I'm wholeheartedly accepting it because I think Trump is a vehicle for a movement and a feeling in politics, not the end all of that. And as a result, we can look at this structural movement, which is going to be here whether or not he is here, and whether or not, and regardless of how he drives it when you're actually reading the book. And so I think a lot of this is about making your own luck and kind of thinking, well, what does the future look like? And I think for leaders and for lawyers, that mindset of like, man, the world is on fire. Every day feels like a fire drill. I can't get past the next week because there's this onslaught of changes happening. But if I could just get to 2026, I could be better off than my competitors if I did this move, right? It's like, how do you actually figure that out? And I see this with companies wrestling with DEI right now. It's like, yeah, you can make that choice to run away from it today because it gives you a short-term gain. But there are communities that are not going to do business with you in 6 to 12 months if you did that. And they may not say it today. So you may be on a sugar high and feel like you're reaping the benefits of running away from something, but you're going to experience the fact that the country is divided. And if you move with the political winds, eventually you alienate both sides. And that's, so I think a little bit of foresight can go a long way.
Well, yeah, you just described exactly how I, and I'm sure everyone listening to this or watching it is experiencing that. Just up and down roller coaster ride of our reality right now. One thing I want to ask you about from the book is something that I think is actually going to be the topic of your talk at the conference, the unruly triangle. So what does that mean? And what are the three things in the triangle and why are they together?
Yeah. So, well, look, as I'm talking, I'm going to pull it up for you so you can actually see it. So
Yeah.
the concept of the unruly triangle, is basically, everyone can see it for a second, right? It's
Mhm.
this idea that politics, law, and technology are all important factors on their own, but they connect together and create new synthetic risks in combination. So politics and law intersect to create geolegal risk, which I've been writing about on my geolegal Substack for the last 58 weeks, right? Which is basically that, like, when you go to court now today, might actually be because of a political issue. It's not just because of a legal issue. Or when you are playing a political game, the law might be used to stop you from winning the political game. It's this intersection of politics and law. It forms one of the sides. It's intersectional. Politics and technology intersect to create what I call artificial politics risk, which is this idea that that technology is influencing politics and politics is influencing technology. And you can't just take a static snapshot of either of them to figure out what the world is going to be like. You need to understand that intersection. So go ahead, great, implement lots of technology, be hyper productive, and then find out that all of the people that are left behind by technology vote to take your business away from you. Like that's an example of it, right? Like people get
Yeah.
angry, they get nationalistic, or they become Luddites or whatever. Like there's an intersection. And then legal and tech intersect in, we tend to refer to the legal tech community, which you and I are both part of. And there are lots of opportunities from that. But in the book, I talk about legal AI risk, like automated lawsuits that can disable your business. I had a piece in Harvard Business Review about that a few months ago. Like a lot of people are not thinking about what they can already see in front of them, which is that when laws run by bots, I can direct those bots at people I don't like because suddenly like this constraint that using the law is expensive goes away, right? Like I could already direct lots of lawyers at all my competitors, but that's not cheap. When that's free, like that becomes a lot more tempting, right? And when customers can do that to companies, that becomes a lot more tempting for them to do as well. So I was on a flight last night that was delayed by a couple of hours. When I can just click a button and my AI automatically files the claim written in the strongest language possible about it made me miss my children's bedtime, and that was very valuable to me. And I have consumer rights that are enunciated here, here, and here. And like I would like retribution in the form of a travel voucher of $500, and it's boom, like, why I would push that button, wouldn't you? And companies like Do Not Pay are already creating that in some form. But 5 to 10 years from now, that type of thing is going to be directed at competitors. It's going to be directed by employees at their employers. It's going to be directed in all sorts of ways. So the unruly triangle is basically saying like you can have a very simplistic view of the world, which only looks at politics, or only looks at tech, or only looks at law. That you will be in trouble. You can look at all three of those things and you will be in better shape. But really the risks you face in the future are the intersections of these things. And your organization's not designed to fight that, right? So the subtitle of the book is called Fighting Back When Politics, AI, and Law Upend the Rules of Business, because you're not helpless, but you need to realize that your legal department may need oversight of government affairs and politics to be successful in the future. Your technology team may need to be interacting with legal and your political folks a lot more than they are today. Your corporate organization is designed for the past. The future is much blurrier. And that's why I think companies are really uncomfortable and flat-footed in this environment. It's because they're not actually organized to fight back. Like I think the Russian sanctions woke everyone up to this. That like their lobbyists were not going to make sanctions unlikely, and their lawyers can tell them what to do once they've been passed. But really, somebody needed to be thinking months before, like there are lots of troops being amassed at the border of Ukraine. We can do some geolegal planning of if Putin walks across the border and there are sanctions, what are the implications? And we can sell those assets off, not in a fire sale, but before he walks across the border. And like that I think is the mindset companies need in the future.
Well, it sounds like a much, much more complex and intertwined world that it sounds like already existed, but we had kind of, looked at it from a more sheltered viewpoint. Um, is there anything, well, I guess technology is part of it, but do you think that there's something within the past 10 years that makes it more fundamental to view the world in that more complex way, that it's necessary to do so?
I think there are really two main factors. One, for the professional lifetime of pretty much every senior executive, the world has been converging. We've been in globalization. We've been in that period from the time, really from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fall of Bear Stearns, right? Like 1989 to 2008, where like it was just this massive rush to get rich, and a single set of rules made it a lot easier. So sure, I'll accept like some, a little bit of a higher bar than I would have in a local environment if I can have one set of rules as a company. And so companies got comfortable with like a single set of rules, convergence, building towards that. And then all that started falling apart. Started with the financial crisis, was exacerbated with the Eurozone crisis. It resulted in Trump's first election in the US. It resulted in Brexit in the UK. It resulted in nativist politics as a response to refugee flows and things like this. And suddenly everybody's fighting for themselves, right? My old boss, Ian Bremmer, called it the G0 world. Instead of a G20 or a G8 making all the decisions, suddenly every nation's for themselves. So the rules fell apart and we're now diverging. So that's like one piece. But the explosion of technology has been another factor. And I think it's generative AI and the advances towards artificial general intelligence present just a radically different risk than, say, the digital transformation wave we had 10 years ago. Like, digital transformation does not provide decisive advantage like having nuclear weapons, but harnessing artificial intelligence to make sure that no matter what, your missile is automatically fired faster than somebody else's missile, that can give you decisive advantage over people who don't have that. That's very, very different. Or making sure harnessing AI in ways that give you business models that scale faster than everybody else, so you have decisive advantage. Like Sam Altman talking about a single engineer with AI building $1 billion company. Well, they could build a $10 billion company or $100 billion company. And once you raise lots of money, it's very hard for anyone to catch up to you. And you can very quickly decide that you want to use what you've built for evil and not for good. And that kind of stuff, this risk of decisive advantage and of societal fracturing, I think is really the big risk, right? I mean, think about, like, we have a very tenuous hold on democratic capitalism today in the US and across Europe, and tech puts a huge stress on that. So, most people don't go on legal podcasts and talk about lawyers like losing their jobs, but we can talk about that if you want. I think AI is coming for white collar workers. And the problem is, like, maybe net they will have more jobs than they lose. But the process of getting there is going to be really, really ugly with big distributional consequences, in the same way that, like, I can hold up a textbook and tell Trump, like, trade creates more jobs than it destroys. It doesn't matter because losers are vocal. The difference with white collar workers is they have political power and they have money. So suddenly when technology threatens their jobs, they have brakes they can pull that slow things down. And that's a little bit different. And what it does is it creates this tension in society towards either leaders using tech for authoritarian purposes, like to clamp down, and we can dive deep in where we see that, or a pull towards socialism, like, hey, I'm an out of work lawyer. I still need to pay my nanny and my second mortgage and my car bill. Like, we should have universal basic income. And today I want it to be 10 times what I thought I wanted it to be when I had a job. Right. And so I think you have these different pulls, but it puts pressure on the business model we all expect of democratic capitalism. And that is like a really different political environment than one of globalization, where everyone, where we're talking about the end of history and everyone's trying to get rich. That's a very different environment than the one we live in today.
So one thing that what you're saying makes me think about is Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions, because what he's saying basically is that once a theory stops fitting reality, that we need to rethink it. Little by little, I think our theory of reality over the past 10, 20 years has shown a lot of flaws, like a lot of flaws in the theory explaining what's happening. And, Trump's election, Trump's re-election, I think has definitely pointed to needing an explanation of why that is, and what are all the influences that made it possible as a reality. And I think for a lot of people, it hasn't made sense. Like, like the divergence between these different interests and how it resulted in where we're at now just has not made sense, doesn't make sense. But I think that what you're talking about and your book explaining it brings a new type of unifying theory to bear on all of these different interests and how they're aligning and how they're amplifying each other. So, like for anyone out there that's really like me, just coping with what's going on, I think that, Sean's book is, it's a beacon to help us through this. And, yeah, I'm just really looking forward to you launching it on the 25th to the world and getting that out there.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I mean, my hope is that people who read it don't feel helpless, right? I think, I give these keynotes and people are like, oh, that was super depressing. And it's like, no, I'm arming you to fight back in this world. Like, I'm not, yes, the world is the way that it is, but like, you have a lot of moves and there are a lot of things you can do, a lot of strategies you can implement in a world like this. And so, yeah, I had to step back and rethink a little bit of the way the world is organized and try and make sense of it. And I think that's part of the reason um, why I was able to put this together in advance of what we're living in, because this is structural, right? We've been living in a rule of law recession. That's not new. 2/3 of the world has not had access to justice, and those of us who have had it are feeling it recede, right? Like, this is facts we've been living with. We're just starting to wake up with what happens when it hits closer to home in places where we didn't expect to see it. And I think that, if we can step back and be honest with ourselves and also do the work to try and prepare, our organizations will be more durable, and entrepreneurs like you like me, like a lot of your listeners, will say that's the business model that needs to be built for this world. That's the public interest thing I can do to make the world a better place in this environment. That's the comments I feel comfortable making publicly without fearing retribution, because they're just general truths. They're not coming from a perspective of culture war. And so, my hope is people pick this thing up, they read it, they tell you and me what they think, and we start a debate, and we start to really think about, like, I don't have a monopoly on the ideas of how to fight back, how to fix this, right? I want people thinking about it. But I want them to feel empowered, and that's really what I hope the core take home is.
So let me ask you a couple of questions that I ask everyone, in the time that we have left. First one is just that I tend to interview a lot of type A's, like yourself. And so like we typically have a lot going on, a lot of things to juggle in the air. I know that you're flying around everywhere for getting ready for the book launch, and not to mention your startup, hence AI and everything else. How do you do it? How do you find a way through it that maybe could benefit other people to know?
Yeah, so here the biggest secret, like the absolute biggest secret, is I gave up caffeine 5 years ago, and that makes it a lot easier for me to show up present, show up with a clear mind, not, adjust to time zones, get good sleep. That kind of stuff matters. And Matt, you treat your body better when you don't have a drug that you can lean on to help yourself through it. Now, I'm not like here to tell you to stop drinking coffee or whatever. Like I love coffee. I'm drinking coffee right now. I'm drinking decaf. But like the reality is that, like, for me, that turned out to be a superpower, because also when I have like half a shot of espresso, I'm good for 12 hours to be incredible, right? And so I think that that's sort of like reducing our dependencies on stuff we don't need so we could turn them on as a superpower is actually pretty important. Um, I also tend to, I have small children. I tend to limit my business trips, my nights away from home. So I will literally fly in and out of places for like a day. I don't, some people will say that's not taking care of yourself. I'm taking care of myself in a different way. I mean, often, like, we didn't get into the business in Rwanda, but often, I would go to Rwanda for 2 nights. I'd sleep on the plane 2 nights and be in Rwanda for 2 nights. And I got to do everything I wanted to do. I got to be with my team, but my kids also knew, like, I'm trying to get back as fast as possible. And I think then you don't have the guilt that you're carrying around about being away and whatever. Yeah, have I put on weight doing that kind of stuff? Sure. Like, I'm not saying this is like the best lifestyle, but if you can evaluate what's important to you, then you can optimize for it. And I think for me, that's been really important, is stepping back and saying, like, I'm not sleepwalking into being away. I'm choosing what I'm doing, and I'm doing it on my terms.
I think you may have answered it, but the last question I always have is just what makes everything worthwhile to you? Like, you're doing all of this stuff. It's a lot of craziness for all of us. What makes it worthwhile for you at the end of the day?
Yeah. So look, I think the journey we've been on at Hence Technologies, check out hence.ai, has been nothing short of fascinating. We literally celebrated our 5-year anniversary this week. We incorporated the same day the World Health Organization declared COVID. So that, talk about, you might be present for all of history, but you're not necessarily reading the tea leaves every minute. The team we have built, the investors who have backed us, the vision we have had motivates me like to no end. Most of the staff that we stood up on our team in Rwanda 5 years ago is still with us today. And I think the ability to feel like we're flying the flag for a team of folks who want to have a greater impact in their community, right? And also at a global level, for talent that doesn't always get distributed opportunities. That to me has been hugely motivating. I think, being able to blaze a different path as an entrepreneur. A lot of people were like, hey, writing a book while you're building a tech startup is like a pretty dumb marketing strategy. And it's like, well, like, these things need to be said because society needs them to be said. And if everybody listens, then it's not a pretty dumb marketing strategy. It'll be a great one, right? So I am finding my current motivation being rooted, of course, in the business we're building, which does both core legal technology stuff like matter management, litigation management, but also a new set of geopolitical and legal risk management stuff. I'm finding a lot of motivation in that. But of course, like at the end of the day, I'm doing it in I'm finding my personal motivation for my family and for making the world a better place for my kids who are going to inherit it. And I struggle a lot with, am I doing enough? Am I channeling it correctly? Would the world be better if all of my resources went into politics? I don't know. It's the journey I'm on now, but hopefully I have a few more decades to continue that too.
Well, you definitely do, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. So
Thanks.
thank you so much, Sean, for being on the show. I truly appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. This has been so much fun.
And so everybody could keep in touch with you and get a copy of your book. Share that with us, how they could do that.
Yeah, so books available on Amazon. There'll be an audio version in a couple of weeks. There'll be a Kindle version too. So feel free to play it at 3 times speed. I won't take offense to it. The best way to get in touch with me, go to geolegal.substack.com, follow my Substack and reply to any weekly Substack you get. I will write back to you. There's a human there. So that's the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Sean. And for everyone who's watching, see you next time. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to LawDroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.